Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the fourth of 5 lectures on Plato's Republic. In this lecture, we're going to look at books 5 to 7, the central books, focusing on this conflict and tension between the philosopher and the city. So let's get started. So as we open up the discussion, in the beginning of book 5, we have, again, a repetition of something that's happened earlier in the dialogue. We have a situation where Socrates felt he was done with the discussion, as he felt was the case at the end of book 1, and he's forced to return back to the argument. He thought it was complete, and the discussion of justice in the city and the soul was all finished, and he was about to continue to discuss bad forms of government and forms of injustice in the city and the soul. This aspect of the argument is delayed until books 8 to 9. So what we have in books 5 to 7 is, in a way, that entire core of the Republic, which many people think of when they think of the Republic. The allegory of the cave, these powerful images of philosophy, are a digression from the actual discussion, the political discussion. So he's prevented from proceeding until he responds to certain objections. The new beginning, we should note, also reenacts the beginning of the whole work. Polemarchus detains Socrates, similar to the way in which he holds him back at the very beginning of the dialogue, having his slave boy run ahead and grab him by the cloak from behind. This time it's Adimantus that Polemarchus uses to stop Socrates. Adimantus insists that Socrates has skirted around essential issues within the argument, namely the beginning of children in the conditions of the city, that is, with the community of wives and children. Socrates hesitates concerning these matters. He doesn't hesitate because he fears being laughed at, he says. He particularly flags that at 451, which suggests that what is to follow is to some extent a comedy. It could be laughed at. And in a way, it's a rewriting of Aristophanes' Assembly of Women. He says after completing the male drama, he will complete the female. So just to remind ourselves of what's going on in Aristophanes' Assembly of Women, disillusioned with male governance, Praxagora leads a group of women to disguise themselves as men and infiltrate the assembly. And they successfully vote to transfer political power to the women. And once in control, the women implement radical reforms, abolition of private property, all wealth is communal, universal equality, everyone receives food, housing, and sexual access, and sexual redistribution. Attractive young men must sleep with older, unattractive women before choosing younger partners. So we have these really radical reforms, a satire of the types of radical political reforms that could be proposed in those types of situations in a time of crisis, as Athens had experienced after the Peloponnesian War. The fact that the women are able to disguise themselves as men, I think Aristophanes pointing to the fact that in this moment of crisis, the men themselves have become effeminate, these types of things in this crisis moment. And we have, let's say, an echoing of this satire in the Republic, in Socrates's discussion right now. Socrates confronts the interjection by the community as 3 distinct waves that he must overcome. He must address the question of the possibility and the desirability of, first, the equality of males and females, second, the community of wives and children, and thirdly, the rule of philosophers. So we'll pass quickly over the first 2 waves, and the first 2 waves largely have to do with that female drama, the parallel with Aristophanes. And in them, I'll just note that human existence and the management of reproduction and rearing are likened to the management of a herd. So we could say whether or not in this good regime is it only is it limiting certain human possibilities to their physical breeding, reducing humans to animal-like reproduction? So when it comes to the third wave, Socrates asserts that unless the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either, apart from the other, are by necessity excluded, there is no rest from the ills for the cities. So the desirability and the possibility of this coincidence of philosophy and political rule has been a question ever since, and it's part of the essential question of the dialogue. the, the fact it's so controversial is emphasized within the dialogue itself. Socrates had hesitated to posit this strange hypothesis, likening the problem to the biggest waves. Of the three waves, this is the biggest, even more so than the community of wives and children and this sort of thing. Socrates presents this paradoxical argument regardless, even if exactly like an uproarious wave, it is going to drown me in laughter and ill repute. In fact, the danger Socrates brings upon himself by uttering this position is more threatening than mere laughter and ill repute. According to Glaucon, quote, you can believe that very many men, and not ordinary ones, will on the spot throw off their clothes and, stripped for action, taking hold of whatever weapon falls under the hand of each, run full speed at you to do wonderful deeds. So there's a risk of violence from the community from this proposal. Socrates' response to this third and biggest wave is apparently more apt to induce violence from the political community than his responses to the previous two waves. The problem seems to involve two interrelated improbabilities: that the philosopher as philosopher would wish to be involved in political life, and that the political community would wish to embrace the philosopher as its ruler. So in the first case, the philosopher is one who's driven by a quest for the highest wisdom. The quest for knowledge of the highest things must occupy all of his time as a philosopher. However, political administration is time-consuming, in fact, all time-consuming. So Thomas More encapsulates this inconvenient fact well in the letter to Peter Giles that he chose to use as a preface to his Utopia. Quote, so almost the whole of my day is devoted to other people's business, and what's left over to my own, and then for myself, that is my studies, there's nothing left. So the question of whether or not the philosopher would, as philosopher, engage in political action comes to light in the first instance out of the essential temporality and finitude of man. This is a point made by Alexandre Kojeve. You see his dates there, 1902 to 1968. So rather than engage in political action, Kojeve says, it appears at first sight, and according to the very definition of the philosopher will devote all of his time to the quest for wisdom. So this is Kojeve in his interaction with Leo Strauss, it's collected in a work called On Tyranny. Socrates says, quote, man who has his understanding truly turned toward the things that are has no leisure to look down toward the affairs of human beings, end quote. So it's highly improbable then, if not impossible, that the philosopher would wish to spend his time poring over the administrative trivia that comprises political rule. And then there's the second improbability or impossibility, that the community would accept the philosopher as a ruler. The key seems to lie in the fact that the pursuits of the philosopher would seem to be of little help in determining the best course of action in relation to an impending economic issue, not to mention impending military threat. In this case, it would seem that the guidance or rule of the economist or of the experienced general would be preferable. So the political life of the community is marked by a valuing of wealth, fame, or power. Those rulers who can secure some or all of these for the ruling faction are the ones with the political skill valued by the community. As Adimantus says in response to Socrates' initial arguments for the benefits of philosophic rule, all those who start out on philosophy most become quite queer, not to say completely vicious, while the ones who seem perfectly decent do nevertheless suffer at least one consequence of the practice you, Socrates, are praising. They become useless to the cities. So being useless in the pursuit of the things valued by the community, it is highly improbable, if not impossible, that the political community would be persuaded to follow a philosopher. So in short, the philosophy and politics tend in opposite directions, and their coincidence would seem to depend on chance, that is opposed to nature. And so this is Strauss's point. And when you think about it, the fact that they're tending in the opposite direction, even let's say a contingent or chance arriving of them together seems to be not natural and against nature, in that, like repelling magnets, you're not going to, even if you try to force the situation, going to be able to bring them together. So Socrates says, in light of this, says that it's only according to our perception that philosophers are useless. They have a usefulness which our limited insight into things cannot understand. And he uses the example of the ship of state here. And I have the quote on the side here. I won't go through it, but it's another example of some of the great images that Socrates uses in this section. So in the current regimes, the philosophic nature is corrupted, and it's either useless or brings ruin to the city. So he says, not one city today is in a condition worthy of the philosophic nature, and this is why it is twisted and changed. So the philosophic nature in today's societies are twisted and corrupted because they're in, as it were, a poor soil. If there were a proper soil, and again, it seems we would only get this proper soil if we had philosophic rule, but we're not going to get philosophic rule, so we have a kind of a circle there. So a rare few, such as Socrates himself, are able to withdraw from the political and remain attached to philosophy. Quote, taking all this into the calculation, he keeps quiet and minds his own business, as a man in a storm, when dust and rain are blown about by the wind, stands aside under a little wall, seeing others filled full of lawlessness. He is content if somehow he himself can live his life here pure of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his leave from it graciously and cheerfully with fair hope. So only in the just regime would philosophic natures not be corrupted. That's the only good soil, by participating in political things. Quote, for in a suitable one, he himself will grow more and save the common things along with the private, but only in that soil. That can only come about if he exists to bring it about. However, this just regime is not realizable, as philosophy and politics tend in opposite directions. Quote, then shall we say that the supremely happy man is the one who is justest and the best, that is the philosopher king who is sovereign over himself, and that the supremely wretched man is the one who is unjustest and worse, that is, again, the man who is most tyrannical and who tyrannizes completely both over himself and over his country. So this is later in the work when he's talking about the unjust regimes and unjust souls, ending with the tyrannical man. And rather than saying that justice, the highest form of individual is the just individual who can rule himself and the political, he says he's sovereign over himself and ends it there. That is a key distinction. Whereas the tyrannical, the most unjust person is one who's tyrannical over himself and others. So Socrates then goes on to describe the nature of philosophers' insight as well as the nature of the philosopher's position in relation to society. He does so by means of three comparisons or metaphorical images: the sun, the divided line, and the cave. So he begins with a description of the ultimate object of knowledge for the philosopher, form of the good, which he compares to the sun. He then further specifies the different levels of knowledge and being by means of the image of the divided line, and then describes in that most famous passage our human relation to these levels of being or reality by means of the image of the cave. So now I would like to talk about those central images of Plato's Republic that are the most famous, especially the famous allegory of the caves. So, but they belong together. To understand the cave, you have to understand all three of these. They form the center of the Republic. This is the center of the whole work. We have the allegory or the image of the sun, which is further defined by the image of the divided line and then brought into human relation with the image of the cave. So let's look at these. And these images come up by way of trying to understand the good. So what we're getting at is trying to understand the good and the philosopher's relationship to the good as the ultimate object of knowledge. Okay, so again, the context. Socrates has constructed the city in speech, a just city, and it would only come about if we had philosopher rulers. Now, philosophers that people see, Socrates says, seem useless, but that's only because they've been corrupted by poor soil in the proper and in the proper regime, they would be able to be uncorrupted. Some are able to get away from the political and not be corrupted, such as Socrates himself, I think we're supposed to imply. And then he goes on to say what philosophers know and how that can be useful. And what they know, their supreme object of knowledge is the good. So how do we understand the good? This is where we come to our images. The question of what the philosopher must study and what they must know, this object of the good. And we also are told that earlier in books 2 to 4, we had talked about the city and the soul, and that was a shortcut. Philosophers will not take shortcuts. He says this 504 B to C. They will need to understand the soul more deeply, philosophers will. So the highest study will be the study of things beyond political justice and beyond that kind of shortcut to the soul. And it will be this idea of the good. So what is this idea of the good? Socrates' point of departure is that there's a world of becoming and a world of being. The world of becoming is of things which are and are not. In the process of becoming an adult, for instance, we can say that one both is and is not an adult or a child. So a child is becoming an adult, and they both are and are not each. So becoming is a process of being and non-being, being mixed. In the realm of being, we have things that do not change and are only. They're not a mixture of are and are not. Our experience of particular things is of a world of becoming. So when I experience a particular pencil, particular chair, I'm experiencing things that change, that have certain limitations. For instance, if we see a particular beautiful person, we see that which is and is not beautiful at once. So even a particular beautiful person will have aspects of beauty, but there'll be other aspects that are not beautiful. And since there are aspects which are not completely beautiful in any experience, we get this is and is not arising in the process of beauty. Only beauty itself, or let's say the form, he calls it, or idea, the idea, or eidos of beauty is completely and unchangingly beautiful. So Socrates says that the idea of the good is the ultimate object of knowledge and is that which allows all of these other ideas, the idea of beauty, the idea of justice, all these things to come to being. So he's not able to give a full description of the good. He can only give a substitute of sorts. He says, let's leave aside for the time being what the good itself is, for it looks to me as though it's out of the range of our present thrust to attain the opinions I now hold about it. But I'm willing to tell what looks like a child of the good and most similar to it. So a couple things there I'll flag as ironic, as we'll kind of see there, is first of all, this it's something that looks like a child of the good. We're going to have to use images. And these are opinions he has about the good. The question is whether or not we can have knowledge of the good. And we're presented images, or let's say a child of the good by Socrates. And we've just had a discussion of, in this regime, this just regime in speech, because of the nature of the reproductive program of the guardians, children would not know their fathers. There would not be a link between children and their source or the father. So this child of the good is not necessarily, according to the, let's say, the irony of the context, not going to necessarily point to the father. He can only give us a substitute of sort, so he compares it to the sun. So the sun is to the visible world what the good is to the intelligible world. The sun grants visibility to the visible and allows us to see the things in the visible world. The good grants intelligibility to the intelligible world and allows us to know things. So if we look at this schematization of it, with the sun, it's the cause of sight. According to this theory, it allows us to see, and the good is the cause of knowing. And the sun dispenses this flood of power of visibility in the visible world, and the good illumines the soul or the psyche and gives the knower the power to know and gives truth to the things known. And whatever fully illumined is in the visible world is clearly seen, and what is fully illumined is clearly known in the intelligible world. And the sun is beyond the visible things that it illumines. And the good is similarly beyond being. It's beyond the intelligible world that it makes intelligible. So the good is the ultimate object of knowledge, because knowing the good of individual things and in general is the mark of true wisdom. And Aristotle, Plato's pupil, articulates this well later on in his metaphysics. He defines philosophy as the quest for wisdom, and for him, wisdom is concerned with the first causes and principles. There are 4 types of cause or principle to be examined by the philosopher: material, formal, efficient, and final. So for instance, a chair, I'm sitting on a chair right now. It has a material cause. It's made out of particular atoms, what have you. And then another cause of the chair is the form or substance of chairness. Let's say it's a device for sitting, let's say. And then the chair maker, whoever makes the chair, as its source of motion is another cause, the efficient cause. And then lastly, the chair's reason for being, its final cause, is a principle for it. Why does one need a chair? So this is where the question of the final cause links up to the good. Why does one need a chair? Well, I need to sit. Well, I need to rest because I work and I rest, and that's part of human endeavor. And why do I work and I rest? What is the cause of my work? Like the final cause, the end, the intention behind that. Well, I have goals in what are the goals of your work? Well, my goals are to make enough money to keep the family happy. Why? Well, because I think that's one of the important duties one has, to live a full life and to be happy. Okay, well, so the ultimate good, the end of all that chain of what I do this in order to do that, I do this in order to do that, is the good as such. In the highest sense, philosophy is that form of making accounts which attempts to articulate the final cause, or the why, of each thing and existence as a whole. So the supreme way of knowing, the highest philosophy is, quote, the one which knows that for the sake of which each thing must be done, and is the good in each case and in general, the highest good in the whole of nature. This is Aristotle in the Metaphysics. So according to Aristotle, the first philosophers regarded material causes as the principle of all things, and the first philosopher to examine causes beyond merely the physical ones was Socrates. So he supposed that nothing could be understood finally unless we know its reason, it's in a deliberative or intentional sense. Like, what is the purpose of that thing? So for Socrates, things by their nature aim at some good or end. It's in this sense that our lives must be examined. So the examined life is one wherein the question is posed concerning that for the sake of which we do or think certain things. One's learning, for instance, is for the sake of this. One's daily routines and habits are for the sake of that. And do they contribute to those ultimate ends? And the examined life is the life wherein one poses that question, what is the good life? Raising these questions leads to the question, what is the good? So that's the examined life is tied to the philosophic life as the examination of the good. So it's difficult for us to approach this understanding of philosophy, I would say, given that we live in the shadow of the modern philosophical revolution, and that revolution took its point of departure a certain narrowing of the Socratic horizon described above. So modern thought has its foundation in three breaks from the classical definition of philosophy. First, the positioning of the human subject as the pivotal locus of truth, as first developed in the metaphysics of Descartes, the refusal to account for the final cause of beings, as first asserted in the natural philosophy of Bacon, and the refusal to account for the goal of society or how things ought to be, as first articulated in the political philosophy of Machiavelli. So Plato's next image, so we have this good as the object of knowledge. We use the sun to try to get an image of it, of what it's kind of like. And next, Plato uses a divided line to talk about, to present an image of what various levels of being on the ontological side of the question, the fundamental nature of the existence of these things. And then on the epistemological side, there are levels to how things can be known or understood. And these are hierarchical. On the left side here, the sun and divided line can be lined up because we can see that the good grants intelligibility, and we have forms here, and the sun grants visibility to this physical realm. And there are two levels within that physical realm that line up to the sun analogy. They're particular things and images of things. Now, the divided line has four levels to it. So we begin at the bottom with illusions. So let's say secondhand impressions or images of images. And that's D, the D segment of the line. And then the next level of the line is where we're approaching, let's say, particular things instead of images of things. And there we can form beliefs about them. And that could be comparable, let's say, to the empirical sciences. We're studying particular things and forming hypotheses. But this is not knowledge, because we can never come to certain knowledge when we're looking at these particular things that are changing in the physical world. Then in the next layer, we're not dealing with the physical things, we're dealing with intelligible things, such as mathematical reasoning based on assumptions. And that's the segment of the line called B. And think of that as like an image of the form of something. And then if you study the form itself, then we're talking about dialectic or pure reasoning. So these are the four levels of knowing and four levels of being that correspond to them. And we're going to see that those hierarchical levels of knowing and being also map onto this next most famous allegory of the cave. So with the first two images, Socrates had demonstrated that philosophers are capable of ruling since they possess a higher form of knowing. Next, with the cave image, he must demonstrate that the philosopher is willing to rule. Okay? Now, this is questionable because remember, this is part of that whole tension of the philosopher in the city. So it's questionable whether or not he succeeds in doing this. The philosopher would only be willing to rule in the city in speech described in the dialogue. But the only way this type of city could arise is through a philosopher becoming a ruler. So we have an image on the right of this allegory of the cave. So Socrates presents this allegory of the cave. He asks us to imagine individuals who have lived their whole life underground in this cave, chained and looking at a wall. And this is what they would assume is the shadows that are cast on that wall, is what they would assume is the whole truth. Now, shadows are cast on this wall by a fire that's up a little bit higher, and puppeteers present image manufactured stick figures in front of that fire, which cast shadows of things. Maybe it's shadows of trees, for instance. Now, these prisoners who've been fastened there all their life in this cave think that those shadows of trees is exactly what a tree is. Now, he asks us to, in order to describe the education of the philosopher, Socrates asks us to imagine a freed prisoner forced to go up these levels of the cave to turn. First of all, there's a turning, that's very important. There's a turning of this freed prisoner from looking at the shadows to looking first at these artificial things, and then to the fire, and then they're dragged out of the cave. And at first, it's so bright they can only look at reflections of things, for instance, as reflections in this lake here, as represented in this picture. Then finally, they can look at things themselves, such as this real tree, and then they can look at the sun as such. Now, this lines up, of course, with the image of the sun and the divided line before that, right? We have the sun outside in the realm of the real things that the freed prisoners dragged and painfully at first, but then is able to look at. It aligns with the idea of the good, and the tree itself is like ideas and or the forms or essences of things, and the reflection of the tree in the lake is like mathematical objects. And the fire inside the cave is like the sun in the sun simile, and the artificial things that cast shadows on the wall are like particular things in the world, and then the actual shadows on the wall are like images of things that we have mere illusions about. So that's the cave allegory. That's the structure. The freed prisoner is dragged up out of the cave through those layers of ascending layers of knowledge that map onto the divided line and to the image of the sun. But that's not where the cave allegory ends. The freed prisoner is forced to return. So there's two movements there that we need to keep into account. And this is when we talk about part of the point of raising this in the dialogue is to say that, yeah, first, philosophers are not useless because they know things that are absolutely crucial for the community, and they will, in certain circumstances, want to come and rule if they're dragged back into this cave. The other thing to keep in mind, and now I'm thinking about the cave allegory with respect to how Martin Heidegger analyzes this passage in a couple of key works, the Essence of Truth on Plato's cave allegory and the Theaetetus, which is a book-length work from the 30s, if I recall, and Plato's Doctrine of Truth, which is more of a published essay going over a lot of the same material. There he focuses on the cave allegory as presenting visibly the Greek experience of truth, which he underscores as aletheia. So in Greek, the word for truth is aletheia, and it's literally translated as unconcealedness. So the A there of aletheia is a privative that is equivalent to our un. It's a tearing away of concealment. And the second component of the word lethe comes from concealment or forgetting. And we'll see that in the myth of at the end of the dialogue, there's an description of what happens to souls in the underworld as they return to their next life, they have to drink from the river Lethe. So there's a suspension or cancellation of concealment or forgetting in truth. Truth is, in the Greek primordial experience, is never there in itself, awaiting for a neutral recording. It's wrested from concealment. Truth is tied to untruth in this Heideggerian reading. And the allegory deals with the process of education in relationship to this truth as unconcealment. We normally think of education as accreditation, but we should remember that paideia, Greek education, classical education in general, is tied to the cultivation of one's character with an eye to their proper ends. So education, our word for education it comes from Latin roots, literally meaning leading out. You can see the etymology there from ex and ducere, so out and leading. So education is a leading out of the cave, quite literally. But the process begins with a turning of the soul. So Plato, in Plato's language, in Greek, it's a periagoge, meaning a turning around or a conversion. Okay, so leading out of the cave is part of education, but it also involves a conversion. Education is a turning around. It's not a matter of just giving people new facts. It's a matter of them turning their soul so that they see things in a new way for the first time. So the other virtues discussed rely on habit and thus are attached somewhat to the body. And we could say that the virtues discussed above, justice, moderation, courage, are political virtues because they're somewhat attached to the body and rely on habit. Whereas philosophic virtue, prudence or wisdom, is more divine and transcends the political virtues. So this is from the Cave Allegory. Socrates says, therefore, the other virtues of a soul, as they are called, are probably somewhat close to those of the body, for they rely not there. They really are not there beforehand and are later produced by habits and exercises, while the virtue of exercising prudence is more than anything somehow more divine. It seems it never loses its power, but according to the way it is turned, it becomes useful and helpful, or again, useless and harmful. So it depends on where the prudence, the eye of the soul, let's say, is turned, and then it can become useful. So the allegory describes a twofold process in relation to enlightenment and unenlightenment. It describes it as a freed prisoner going out and then returning. And it's important to remember that both parts are in the allegory. And the cave figures forth our existence and our society as we know it. The cave is us. The cave is our society. And the philosopher wants to escape and just stay out there. So Socrates, like the philosopher, is one who doesn't normally leave the city, but in certainly in his own way, let's say symbolically, he's always transcending the city's limits. So the philosopher, like the prisoner, is in the city, but is always, let's say, on his way out. In all of Plato's dialogues, with the notable exception of the Phaedrus, Socrates is never depicted outside of Athens. And we should note that the Republic, this as a dialogue, takes place at the very limits of Athens, at the Piraeus. So Socrates is one who dwells in the city almost exclusively. However, in another sense, of course, he transcends the limits of the city. So the unfolding of philosophic thinking and questioning had been presented in terms of a movement along a divided line from opinion to reasoning and dialectic, or from images and physical things to forms. However, in introducing this conception of philosophic thinking, he introduces yet another image, the allegory of the cave. So rather than a transition in the discussion to the level of pure dialectic, a transition that would abandon rhetoric and the realm of images, Socrates provides yet another image. And what does this peculiar lack of a transition connote is that in the space that philosophic activity occurs in the space of the dialogue, in the speech, in the word, etc. So philosophy is questioning, but this questioning can only take place through dialogic confrontation. So the philosopher is also, and in the first instance, prisoner in the cave. That's where they start. He, along with the other prisoners, is bound and has been there so all his life. The prisoners see only the shadows and stick figures, and the prisoners think that these are the whole truth. And Socrates says that makes them like us. He includes himself in that, right? And it's only then that Socrates raises the question of what were to happen if someone was cured. He says cured there, which is interesting, of their illusions. And he doesn't ask us to imagine the philosopher as someone who's never been a prisoner, nor does he ask us to imagine a mass enlightenment. It's going to be one person, one or a few. And the moments are rare and fleeting, I think, is what we're supposed to get. We find ourselves in that cave. We're fixated, looking at these images on the wall. We're taking these as whole truths, and then maybe the few can divorce themselves from those opinions. But to do so, to be cured, the prisoner has to be dragged. It's a painful process, and it's difficult for us, according to the allegory, to turn away from our ancestral myths, the opinions of the many, what they're saying on TikTok or social media, and we encounter that our lives. So in this way, philosophy is not a solitary affair. We need to be helped and prodded on by the discourses of others. The model of the solitary figure that retreats to the mountaintop to experience his enlightened bliss is the image of the mystic, not of the philosopher. This is the significance of the fact that Socrates says that the philosopher does not deserve that name unless, in the final analysis, he also returns to the cave in order to facilitate or provoke the process for another, not to rule in the political sense, but to rule in the sense that Socrates is ruling the group of men in the dialogue itself. Is he somehow going to try to prod Glaucon to turn as well? And through the course of the discussion, we see an example of this type of turning, as I hinted. It's worth noting that as Socrates describes this process of philosophic turning, Glaucon has a turning of his own. At first, he had seen affairs only from the perspective of those in the cave. He had asserted that the very idea of a philosopher ruler would invoke a violent response from the average citizen. Then, during the discussion of the allegory, he comes to demand that the philosophers be allowed to remain outside the cave and not be forced to return and help rule. He has come to see the matter somewhat from the perspective of the philosopher. He's had a turning, provoked by Socrates, provoked by one who was outside the cave and returned to, not for political rule as such, but to rule a small group of friends in a city in speech. We could say that the dialogue with Socrates provoked Glaucon's turning, and I've mentioned this before, but on Socrates' persuasion of Glaucon, you can refer to Xenophon's Memoirs of Socrates. So the turning or education that Plato has in mind can be brought about by means of a conversation with thoughtful individuals, as Socrates, but there's not a lot of Socrateses around. So what do you do? What does one do? So I think this, and this is why Plato wrote, I think, and this is why other great white writers write. I think the turning can be provoked as well by having a dialogue with the great thinkers of the past, by this republic of geniuses through the tradition. And in this is the spirit in which I think if people want to, let's say, try to get out of a cave, if only for a moment, the cave of their existence and their current opinions and the opinions of their particular socio-political world, by trying to genuinely dialogue with the view of the wisest writers of the past who are revealing the world in a different way. And if we're being truly humble and opening ourselves to that possibility, then we can be prodded to experience that type of turning. So I won't go through this in detail, but again, as with all the lectures, you can download this as a PDF, and you have a diagram here that tries to summarize how the sun and the line on the left forms in the visible, in the forms in the intelligible, particular things in the visible, sun granting visibility to the visible world, good granting intelligibility to the intelligible world, how that lines up with the epistemological levels of the divided line, how those are reflected in the allegory of the cave in terms of the different levels of things and perceptions of the prisoner inside and outside the cave, as well as the mode of truth as aletheia, both concealment in the realm of the cave and unconcealment, the tearing away of that outside the cave. So with that, I'll end this lecture. The next lecture will be the last of our lectures on Plato's Republic. We'll look at books 8 to 10. Thank you very much.